Hello and welcome to our second little mini lecture on operant or instrumental conditioning and how we use that to affect environmental behavior. So in this one, we're going to build on what we talked about last time and talk about how we can help people move in a direction toward more consistent positive environmental behavior. We talked last time about how we can use reinforcements, positive consequences, to affect people's behavior positively, uh, particularly for things that they aren't already intrinsically motivated to do. This brings into mind, though, a particular concern when we start rewarding behaviors, and that's a process called overjustification. That is, if we take something that somebody already is intrinsically reinforced for doing, and then apply extrinsic rewards for doing that behavior, what happens over time is that can actually reduce the amount of intrinsic motivation somebody has. For example, here we have a kid that likes to read, and then you have a prize for reading that's through an incentive program through school, and then basically people will say, oh, I'm not going to read unless I get the prize. We see the same sort of thing going on with grades, that people don't go above and beyond, perhaps unless they get extra credit or something like that. So, uh, for example, if there's something that you do for environmental reasons from a moral or ethical decision, and then all of a sudden turn it into a business or investment decision um, by paying for it, right? Does that undermine one's ethical judgments by making it about the money instead of about doing what's right? And so we have to sort of balance why and understand why people do what they do to try to not end up having to reward things that we want people to do naturally. We want people to engage in the behavior because they want to, right? We want to move people in the opposite direction from overjustification, that we want to take kids who don't like to read and by rewarding it, cause them to like to read instead of the other way around. And so generally the way we try to help people internalize behavior is through a process called stretching the ratio, by using schedules of reinforcement to try to help move people from unmotivated or amotivated through levels of extrinsic motivation, that they do things because they're getting rewarded for it or want to avoid punishments, and then eventually they internalize it and do it because of intrinsic reasons, because it's the right thing to do, that sort of thing. So um, ultimately we're trying to help people move toward a sense of doing it because it gives a sense of belonging or connectedness, a sense of uh, choice or personal freedoms, a sense of mastery or confidence or self-efficacy, and a sense of purpose or altruism from doing something. So we want to try to emphasize these intrinsic reasons and de-emphasize as much as possible the extrinsic reasons. So initially we would start with rewards on continuous reinforcement schedules. That is, every time they do the right behavior, they get a prize. You put the can in to recycle the can, you get 5 cents, right? That you do it because of being able to get money for it. But continuous schedules are not all that good for persistence of behavior, because the minute the machine breaks, you stop doing what you're doing, right? And so there are ways that we can adjust the schedule through variable or fixed schedules where we don't reward every single time. We don't give a consequence every single time. We give it enough to maintain the behavior, but not so much that people do it because of the behavior. So a fixed ratio schedule is based on doing it a certain number of times. Instead of only doing it once, you have to do it several times. Give Carl a banana every 5 times he says what, instead of every time he says what. a fixed ratio schedule, a defined number of answers, right? You have your card, you have to turn in a certain number of things or buy a certain number of things, and then you get a prize. A variable ratio schedule, on the other hand, still is based on the number of times you do the behavior, but you don't get rewarded every single time, and you don't get rewarded as predictably. You know it's on an average rather than a set number. So, for example, shooting baskets, you don't know how many shots you have to take before you get one in. If you have a slot machine, you don't know how many times you have to pull it before you get the jackpot. If you're fishing, you are always hoping to catch that big fish, and you know you won't catch it every single time, but of course you can't win if you don't play, right? So you have to keep putting the hook in there in the hope of maybe catching that big one. The third type is the fixed interval schedule, where instead of based on the number of times you do the behavior, you do it after a set amount of time has elapsed. So a fixed interval says every 10 minutes you can get something if you're doing what you need to do over a period of time. That after that time has elapsed, you get your prize. So you just don't pay out as often. In a variable schedule, the variable interval schedule is based on an average. So instead of getting a pop quiz every Friday, you get it once a week on average, but you don't know what day it's going to come. Not as predictable a schedule. So what we find is that we have these different schedules, and when we start having choices between behaviors, we have to decide what behaviors do we do, right? We tend to pick the ones that are most reinforcing at any given point in time. We call this in psychology the matching law, that you choose whichever consequence is going to be most reinforcing at the time. And so they've actually come up with a mathematical ratio for this, but that your ratio of behaviors is going to be proportional to the ratio of rewards. And that works as long as you can switch back and forth between tasks fairly easily. So if they're both on ratio schedules, you do the ones that give you the biggest pay for the least amount of effort, right? You work on if you have two classes that are having stuff at the same time, you pick the one that has the best prize, right? If you have to work for an hour to get a paycheck, you work for that hour in the one that has the biggest paycheck. If you have interval schedules, right, you have some times where you have quizzes in your class every 2 weeks, and sometimes it's every 3 or 4 weeks in a different class, that basically you work hard as things are coming up, and after you take one test, you switch effort to the next upcoming test and go back and forth based on which due date is most imminent. Ultimately, the technical terms for this are melioration and maximization or optimization. That when you're picking, do you pick the one that is giving you the most immediate reward in the short term or the best reward in the long term? Melioration is saying, I'm willing to take a smaller paycheck overall if I get paid more frequently. Maximization says, I'm going to be willing to get paid more in the long run, but not as often. So the tricky part about environmental stuff is that a lot of times what we're talking about when we talk about planetary strength and health is little things that add up to long-term costs and benefits. And so as much as we want people to try to stop global warming over the next 50 years, people are more likely to buy energy efficient cars based on the current price of gasoline than they are the current state of the planet and how fast the earth is warming up. So we get a fairly complex sort of process. Again, coming back to this ABC kind of model of what are the triggers, what are the behaviors we're looking for, and what is the nature of consequence. This diagram here shows how complicated all the different possible consequences are. We start thinking about all the possible causes and effects on our behavior and aspects about the behavior and the various triggers that are involved in a complex environment. So how do we do this in an environmental standpoint? One example is the Environmental Qualities Incentive Program that basically says if you're a farmer, right, and you don't treat your land right, eventually your land doesn't produce as much. And so in trying to incentivize farmers to engage in terracing or crop rotation or combining, in this case, forestry and livestock in a way that helps uh, maintain the water, maintain the ground cover to prevent erosion, um, keep habitats, those sorts of things. And so if there are ways that we can provide extra financial incentives to help encourage people to do the right thing environmentally. Another example of this, if we're talking about companies and how companies can try to help people be more environmental, right? There are lots of different consequences that you could get besides a raise, right? You could get time off, you could get employee of the month, you could get promotion opportunities to different sorts of um, preferred jobs or preferred offices or extra days off or uh, different opportunities for choice for what job tasks you do things that have more meaning, have more contact with management, um, all sorts of things that companies have tried to try to encourage people to recycle and conserve energy and all the various environmental things that they could choose to do. So we'll give that a chance to you to think about what you might suggest and implement if given the opportunity.